I'm fortunate I have a son-in-law who lives.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for showing up for Mr. Dwoskin. So I have a few announcements to make. Next Wednesday, we have, you've got to read this. It'll be 5 librarians, and they will be talking about their summer reads, suggesting summer reads. It will be held outside in the Ashkelon Gardens, which is behind the library. And if it rains, it will be held indoors. And also we have a concert coming up on the 28th of June, which will be Electro Samba, and that will be at Trudeau Park. And that starts at 7 p.m. The one for next week is, you've got to read this, and it's at 2 p.m. So thank you very much for showing up, and Mr. Dwoskin will present his In the Headlines lecture series. Thank you.
What is Electro Samba? That's what I'd like to know.
I don't know. I guess it's like super fast.
I don't know. The samba is Brazilian dance, you know, it's really good. Anyway, can you hear me now? Is it good? Yeah. Because last time you were saying it was a bit fuzzy, you know. I'm sorry that there aren't more people that are here like they were last week, but it was pretty crappy. I underestimated the weather. I walked out because this morning I was out a bit and I said, oh, it's nice, you know, and I just didn't look, and I came out, it was cold and drizzly and everything else. So last week I spoke about Israel, and I said I would continue this week to answer the question, what is this current, we'll call it crisis, all about? But before I speak about that, I would like to mention in the news that we just heard today, that the Prime Minister of Italy 4 times died, Mr. Berlusconi. And he, in a certain sense, was a model for Trump. So I would have to say that his personality, his way of doing things was a path that Trump followed, either purposely or not, and I would say not, because Trump's not interested in anybody else but himself. But by coincidence, you know, similar things happen in different places, and it's coincidence, it's not that one influences another. But I would have to say that Berlusconi was the original Trump. Original in what ways? First of all, he's estimated, it is estimated that his net worth is about $7 billion. Now, Trump calls himself a rich person, but no one has ever really had a good, quite strong look at what his finances are, because the debts that he owes could be more than the assets that he has. There certainly is not net 7 billion. And Mr. Berlusconi made his money in communications, owning TV stations, radio stations, transmitting companies, newspapers. Then he bought real estate. Then he went to the sports teams. His empire was really quite large, based in Milan. And it was later in life, like Trump, that he decided to get into politics. From a right-wing populist point of view, exactly the same as Trump. And just like Trump, he faced many charges of tax evasion, of bribery, of other assorted miscellaneous financial misdeeds. And just like Trump, he never admitted he was wrong. Unlike Trump, he was actually convicted once out of maybe 30 different trials. He lost one. And because he was so old, they sentenced him to community service and working in a church basement. You know, that was about it. Also, like Trump, he had the personality of, let's say, dealing or being attracted to young, beautiful women. And like Trump, he used his power to get whatever he wanted. So, you know, the parallel between these two characters is really quite strong. The difference is that, and they were both quite skilled politicians. The difference is in the case of Berlusconi is he started his own political party called Forza Italia, whereas Trump just took over or captured the Republican Party, which was already an existing party. But like I said, Berlusconi is going to have a state funeral, and I doubt very highly that the same thing would happen to Trump if the opposition was in power. His demise really has a political effect in the country because his party is the second biggest party in the government's coalition. So it's going to lead to some questions, some instability. It's also going to lead to his family fighting over his fortune because he had at least 2 wives. He had a bunch of children by different women, and they're all, fighting each other over who gets what. So in that way, similar to Trump. So you could see, just with a sort of a thumbnail scratching, how similar these two characters are. And basically that's the story. Now, let me, we'll travel back to the subject that I had spoken about last time, about Israel. And the question was, of course, what is the crisis that's happening there now, and why is it a crisis, and what's going on? And like everything else, you have to sort of reach back into a bit of the past to figure out what's going on in the present. The current issue is called in shorthand, judicial overhaul. So the current crisis has to do with a fundamental change that the government wants to make in how judges are selected to the Supreme Court and what the powers of that court are going to be. And you would have to say that this issue goes back a long ways. And the issue is fundamentally a question of who has the ultimate power to decide on whether laws are illegal or illegal. Now, if we go all the way back to 1948, when Israel was established, the question immediately arose was to say, well, should Israel have a constitution that will iron out the questions of the division of powers, the structure of the government, how leaders are chosen, what rights do individuals have in society? All of these questions are fundamental to how a country operates. Some countries, like, have a constitution, like the United States. Some have a little bit of a constitution, like in Canada, that's been added on to. Some countries, like Great Britain, have no constitution at all. And they all manage to operate in a democratic fashion. The leaders of the country at the time, Ben-Gurion, the prime minister, he wanted to have a written constitution because he said, look, you can't build a building without a blueprint. You can't build a building without written sets of fundamental structures that you can, build your building around. At least everybody knows what's the foundation. If you don't have a strong foundation, you won't have a strong building. However, in a direct line from then till now, the religious parties objected. What they said was that the Torah is the only constitution that Israel needs. And that if you pass any laws, if you pass a constitution or create a constitution, if the constitution in any way comes in conflict with the Torah or with halakha, with the religious interpretations of what the laws are, then religious people will be in a fundamental conflict. How could we follow the state laws when these laws contradict what religious law says? And for that reason, they started to postpone the writing of a constitution, and then they just gave up completely. And that's why Israel doesn't have a constitution. They do have something that they call basic laws, which are laws which are supposed to be harder to change than other laws. And these laws do deal with the structure of the government and the powers of the government and things like that. But it's not enshrined in any sort of a constitution, and these laws could be changed, by voting in the Knesset. So Israel doesn't have a constitution. Now, the roots of the conflict that we're talking about now have to do, as I mentioned before, with the desires of the religious bloc in Israel, the religious parties in Israel representing the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox electorate versus the powers of the government to rule over all of the people. And the sort of immediate conflict came about when people went to court to say that the exemptions given to Orthodox people from serving in the military is unfair and is illegal. And because they said, look, if everyone is supposed to be treated equally in the country, how is it that just because you're Orthodox, you don't have to serve in the army? We feel that this puts an unfair burden on those who have to serve in the army, because it means that their service has to be of a longer time because there's fewer soldiers going in. It means that they take on risks that other people don't take on. It means that they are losing out on years of life and years of possible education that other people in the ultra-Orthodox sphere can take by themselves. So we feel this is fundamentally unjust, and we're going to court. The Supreme Court agreed with them. Now, in a typical Israeli way, rather than the Supreme Court saying that this exemption law is illegal, in other words, the law of exempting ultra-Orthodox males from going to the army, rather than saying it's illegal, what they said was to the government, we are going to give you 6 months to fix the situation, whatever fix means, do something. Well, 6 months happened, the government did nothing. But what the government did was it asked for another 6 months. Okay, now take a guess how many extensions the government has asked for in this law. How many? Now 30, the right answer. So clearly then, the government felt, look, we're stuck between the rock and a hard place. If we do what the court wants us to do, we will lose the support of the ultra-Orthodox parties and our government will fall. If we ignore the law, the court will keep coming after us and giving us deadlines to do something, which makes us look bad. So the solution that the government came up with is to fundamentally change the court and the powers of the court. That's where this comes from. This has been brewing. It's not a yesterday problem. This has been brewing now for years. Because what the government said is, you know what? Why should the court tell us what to do? We are the elected government. We were elected by the people in a fair election. And why should an unelected court have the right to tell us that our laws that we pass by popular opinion, that these laws are invalid or illegal? We feel that this is a travesty of democracy, okay? So on the one hand, they want to reduce the powers of the court. That's not so easy. On the other hand, going back to the ex-President Trump, we say, well, we have another idea. Instead of abolishing the court's powers, what if we just change all the judges on the court to people like us? And then we won't have to worry about what the court says, because they'll say whatever we tell them to say. If you recall, Trump appointed 3 Supreme Court judges out of 9. So if a majority in the US Supreme Court is 5, he appointed 3 of them himself. So the conservative element in the US Supreme Court is now at least 6-3, something like 6-3. Yeah, we'll call it 6-3. So the conservative side, in other words, since the Supreme Court judges in the US can serve, I think, it used to be a lifetime. I think they might have to retire at 85. But no, I think it's still a lifetime. So what Mr. Netanyahu wants to do is to change the method by which Supreme Court judges are chosen in Israel. Now, the Supreme Court judges are chosen in Israel in a semi-similar way to they're chosen in Canada, meaning that they're chosen by a group consisting of fellow judges, of law faculty people. The government has a couple of votes. The opposition has a couple of votes. It's a kind of a combination of people to choose the most distinguished jurists in the country. And that's how it's been done. Generally speaking, up until these days, it's been considered to be kind of not that political. But not that political in the sense that they were not an agent of a particular political party. But there has always been a feeling in Israel that since the intellectuals and since the elite in Israel and the law students and all of that, since they're mainly coming from an Ashkenazi background, being, you know, a European background, and since in general, Jews of European origin in Israel tend to be liberal, therefore, the court in Israel tended to be liberal, not by design, but just because these are the people who are qualified to serve on the court, and that's how they end up getting on the court. So considering that this sort of liberal element has often been in conflict with the Netanyahu government, he looked at the Supreme Court as an enemy of his and therefore an enemy of the country. Now, what other issues have they gotten involved in, the court? Lots of times they get involved in issues where the government wants to deal with either the Arab citizens of Israel or the people in the West Bank. So, for example, if the government takes over lands in the West Bank that belong to Palestinians and gives it to settlers to build settlements on, the people who are kicked off their land will hire a lawyer, go to the Israeli Supreme Court, and try to get a hold on proceedings until the court case gets resolved. So this is what the government hates in Israel, because the court is telling it what to do. Similarly, in many cases of sort of individual rights versus group rights, or individual rights versus the state, the Supreme Court often sides with the state, with the individual rather than with the state. And this is naturally what the government hates, because they say, you know, we want to do whatever we want, and we don't need the courts looking over our shoulder. So this is the background of the conflict between the government on the one hand and the courts on the other hand. So this so-called judicial reform was meant to deal with both these questions. The reform has to do with choosing Supreme Court judges, which would stop being done by a panel that would be a kind of neutral panel to being the judges being chosen by the government itself on a basis of them having more representatives than anybody else on the panel that chooses judges. So that's really the main reform that the government wanted to do. The second thing is that the government wants to say that any law that the government passes ipso facto is a legal law, that the Supreme Court should not be able to override a law passed by the Knesset. Now, this goes back to the whole idea of what people considered a democracy to be. And if you believe that a democracy is only one where the majority decides, then the minorities have no protection whatsoever, because they're, and we know it very well here. Quebec is a democracy, but it's only a partial democracy, because protection of the weaker elements in society and minorities in the society are one of the essential definitions of what a democracy is. There has to be a balance between the power of the government and individual rights in the weaker and minority elements of the population. And that's what the Israeli government wants to get rid of. So this is really a groundbreaking initiative that the government is doing, because for 75 years, they've never had this idea of the prime minister deciding who's going to be on the Supreme Court. And that's why there's been so much opposition to this plan, because they know that if this goes through, the government will be able to do whatever it wants to whoever it wants without anybody coming back and saying anything about them. So, for example, if the government decides that gays should not be allowed to have a parade, they just pass a law saying gays are not allowed to have a parade, and that's the end of it. If they pass a law saying, for example, that only Jews who are Orthodox are allowed to pray at the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, well, that's what the law says. We have to follow it. So you can see very well how liberal elements of the Israeli society would be affected by one of these changes that would allow the government to decide everything. And since the government of Israel today is the most right-wing, the most what would we say? The most exclusionary government that they've ever had, meaning that there's no one in the government from the center of the political spectrum. There's no one in the government from the secular side of Israeli society, then clearly those people who are not in the government feel much more threatened than they would be if they didn't try to pass these laws changing the whole legal system. And that's why for 23 weeks in a row, I think it is 23, that hundreds of thousands of people have shown up to demonstrate against the laws, that the foreign governments like the United States has intervened to tell the Netanyahu government not to go through with what they want to go through, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why it's become such a huge issue. It's not a local kind of political issue over who gets, a building permit in this city or in that city, or who gets to run the bus lines in this city or that city, or awarding let's say a new contract to a new TV channel to operate. These are more kind of local type of things that also have implications for this whole national struggle idea. But the whole idea of changing the rules of the game from the get-go is something that people in Israel realize right away how important this issue is. So that's why so many people are showing up to demonstrate about this. His party is partly secular. It's partly secular, and partly not secular. It's, as I explained once, I think last week, his party is a union of two different streams, a kind of a nationalistic stream, which is more traditional Judaism, and a liberal free enterprise business part, which is traditionally not religious. But the national side overcame the other side, in a gradual process over the years. And all the more liberal parts of his party, like the Meridor family, who are big business people, or Benny Begin, Menachem Begin's son, and others were just thrown out because they weren't nationalistic enough for the party. Yeah, so yeah, let me just see now what we're going to talk about. So these are some of the, now, what I wanted to say now is to give you a taste of what some of the proposals that the government has come up with since they were elected in November. And we're talking about November, December, 6 months, I guess, 7 months to say. What have been some of the things that they have advanced or tried to advance that have been so controversial? I think that's probably that. Oh, let's see. Oh my goodness. Well, I don't even know where to begin. There's just so many. Okay. But the fundamental element of all of their things is that the religious parties in Israel have pretty well unlimited power to get whatever they want. That's one theme. That nationalistic anti-Arab feeling has unlimited power to do whatever it wants. That's the other theme. So if you mix those two together, you get what's the kind of ideological background of the party. And then when you look at what they've actually done to fulfill these, then you get an idea. It's hard to connect those ideas with what's happening on the ground. So I have some examples or whatever examples just to give you. Here's one where one of the ministers said, Jewish people don't want Arabs living in their neighborhoods or in their cities. It's normal. Why should they? Therefore, it's not up to an Arab to decide where he wants to live. It's really up for the Jews to decide where the Arabs should live. So they just passed a new regulation that says that any community that has 1,000 families or less can make their own sort of committee to admit people to their town or their village. In other words, it's like, a co-op, and you have a co-proprietor, a co-op here, where you want to rent or buy an apartment, you have to meet with the co-op board, and they'll say yes or no. In order to keep Arabs out of Jewish settlements in northern Israel, they just passed this regulation. And they say, well, the reason is because we want harmonious communities. We don't want people to be fighting in their communities. The fact is that the Israeli government refuses to give building permits to Arab towns. So that means they don't want them to expand the territory that they occupy. So they don't give them building permits. So there's nowhere for these people to live. So if they go out to a Jewish town to rent an apartment, well, if they rent an apartment from somebody and all the neighbors complain, hey, we don't want an Arab in our building, what are we supposed to do about it? The court would say, well, it's too bad. People have a right to live wherever they want. As long as they pay the rent, that's fine. But that's not good for the Netanyahu government. Netanyahu government says, well, the community itself should decide whether they want Arabs living in it or not. That's the way. So this is a new regulation that they just put out. Previously, I have to say, there was a regulation like that, but only for small communities of 200 people or less. Meaning that what they didn't want is, let's say you have a small type kibbutz, where everyone lives a quiet life and they're all farmers, and they didn't want, people moving in who are going to be blasting their stereos and having parties and inviting people from other cities to come in and disturb the peace type of thing. That was the original idea of it. But of course, this idea was then adopted by the government to say, well, forget the 200, we'll make it 1,000. 1,000 is already like a big place. And so in addition to all the informal ways of keeping Arabs out of your town or out of your apartment, this is a formal legalization of this sort of discrimination. So that's the one thing. They just passed this, just this past week. 2 weeks ago, they just put this in. Another one, there's a minister of anti-gayness. So this guy, he was elected on the anti-gay platform, and he wants to eliminate gays' rights to have any public presence in the state of Israel. He doesn't want any books to be published that have any gay themes. He wants to outlaw the flag, the gay flag, from being flown in public. Just to give you an idea, this hasn't been passed yet, but this is on his agenda to come up with. This is Minister Maoz. Minister Maoz, he ran specifically on a platform of anti-gayness. And he was just given the job of promoting Jewish values in schools, if you can imagine. So it's up to him to decide what kind of Jewish values are taught in schools, and he's busy getting after that. Let me just see here. Now, the other one that they came up with is a law to fire teachers. So here the idea is we want to make sure that all the teachers who teach in the country are loyal to the state. Now, who are the teachers who could be not loyal to the state? It's Arab teachers. So they want a committee to interview each and every Arab teacher to make sure that they're loyal to the state. And if they're not, they could get fired. So that's a new plan. This plan is called a plan to support the combat against terrorism. So obviously, if an Arab teacher has anti-state values, he's next to being a terrorist, and if he's a terrorist, he shouldn't be allowed to teach in school. So that's the progression of the thinking there. And the teachers will have to pass a security check. Arab teachers will have to pass a security check to make sure that they have no black spots on their record. But Jewish teachers don't have to pass any security checks at all. So this is a new regulation that they're going to put into effect. Then they have another one. The Palestinian flag should not be allowed to be raised at demonstrations. Now, like Israel in 1994 signed an agreement with the Palestinian Authority. They recognize them and they recognize them. Israel recognizes that the Palestinians have a national presence in that they have complete control over their own towns in the West Bank. Okay, and Israel recognizes this is part of the peace agreement that was signed in 1994. So how is it possible that you could say, well, you can't have a Palestinian flag being raised in Israel? Just the idea of seeing a Palestinian flag gets people so angry that they want to outlaw it, which is one of the proposals in this new law against raising a Palestinian flag in Israel. Some of the Arab Israelis, all of whom are of Palestinian origin, identify themselves as Palestinians, and some don't. But the idea that raising a flag should be a crime is obviously, it goes against freedom of speech. It goes against all kinds of things, especially to a country or a place that you recognize as being legitimate. So that's another proposal. The other ones, well, one was just passed today, seemingly innocuous, that up until now, if you immigrated to Israel under the law of return, you could get a passport right away. And now they just changed this to saying, well, you have to live in Israel for 1 year to get a passport. It seems reasonable, by the way. But what's the motivation for this law? The motivation is simply that the religious parties don't want Russians and Ukrainian Jews coming to Israel, getting an Israeli passport, and then leaving the country to go live someplace else. In fact, they don't want Russians or Ukrainian Jews to come to Israel at all, because most of them are not Jewish by religious law, meaning they don't have a Jewish mother. The law of return says you have to have one grandparent who is Jewish to be able to come to live in Israel. And the religious parties want to change that law to saying you have to have a Jewish parent. But for now, they got the government to agree not to allow people to get a passport unless they live in the country for a year, hoping that these Russians will just not come to Israel because they won't be able to get a passport. In other words, just to keep the number of Russians and Ukrainians down from coming into the country. So that law was just passed yesterday, I saw. What else do I got here? Oh yeah, Israel has passed something called the nation-state law in a really, this was under the Netanyahu government. It was really it was meant to be a kind of a constitutional law. The nation-state law said, let's put it like this. The Declaration of Independence said that Israel is a Jewish state. But it said that all citizens would have equal rights. Okay, so Jewish state was something to be, was in practice, meaning that the Hebrew language would be the primary language of the country, but Arabic would be a second official language. It meant that Israel would use the Jewish holidays as their calendar. It meant that the Sabbath would be the day of rest. It meant that the law of return, which was passed 2 years later, which allowed Jews to come to live in Israel, this is what established Israel as a Jewish state. This wasn't enough for the Netanyahu government. They passed something, the nation-state law, which said in essence that the Jews are the only collective group in the country that have any collective rights. That the whole country has to be developed in order to ensure the primacy of the Jews in the country. And what that said, it also took Arabic from being an official language to being a non-official language. This has to do something to do with the idea of supporting the settlers in the West Bank, because this would mean that the territories that they are settling in belong to them, because Israel is primarily a Jewish state, and they're doing is settling the land of ancient Israel. Now this was the philosophy guiding this nation-state law. Now, who was the most upset by this law? Who do you think? The one group that really, really was upset. It was the Druze people in Israel, because the Druze serve in the military, not voluntarily, but as a decision that they made in 1948 to cast their lot in with the Jewish people in the War of Independence. And they said, look, we as a group of people, we didn't sign this agreement individually. We signed this as a whole group of people, as an ethnic group. We serve exactly the same time. We make the same sacrifices as all the other soldiers. And now you're telling us that we as a group don't count in the state of Israel because only the Jews count. And so, of course, the Netanyahu government said, we don't care. When the opposition got into power under Mr. Bennett, they said, we have to fix this, but they never fixed it. And so the situation is still the way it was as far as that is concerned. But this nation state law is now, they want to expand it to make it even more specific, to make it even more fundamental to the whole being of the state. And this has to do, again, with the settlers in the West Bank. It has to do with education in the schools. And this education issue is also really important because what's happened over the years is that the curriculum in the state schools, not the religious schools, but the state schools, has been changed gradually to push a religious nationalistic viewpoint onto the students. There were a few items in the papers that were just published about this lately. One was in a secular school that girls were sent home if their shorts were too short. Now, you know, in a state school, that shouldn't matter because there is no school uniforms. They could wear whatever they want. The history of Israel is being reinterpreted to say that from the prophets and the rabbis of the Middle Ages down to modern day Israel, it was always a religious aspect of the country which was the most important. And they eliminated the idea that David Ben-Gurion was a socialist, that the kibbutz movement was the one that was the pioneers in the country. That whole aspect of history is being completely eliminated. In fact, a picture of Theodor Herzl, you know, the founder of Zionism, they published a picture of him wearing payas. The guy had a long beard, but completely secular. His children didn't end up marrying Jews. But, you know, in order to continue this little story of theirs, they published a picture of him with payas, with the earlocks, the long earlocks. What else? The Minister of Security, Ben Gvir, he's been in the news now so often, but you know, he wants to be able to choose the chiefs of police and to order the police to do whatever he wants. So this is also a change from previous practices in the country. So that's that. What else? Oh my goodness. Oh yeah, they want to just, this came up today, that they have a law in Israel on administrative detention against terrorists. So in other words, if you're fighting against terrorism, and in Israel it means against Arab terrorism, the Shin Bet, the security officials, have a right to arrest somebody and hold them without trial. And they can hold them without trial for 90 days, and then they can ask the court for another 90 days, and another 90 days, and another 90 days. This law is actually taken over from when the British occupied Palestine. So now what the government wants to do is to say, okay, what we want to do now is to extend this law to basically the Israeli Arab population, to allow us to hold these people at will without charging them. Because up until now, this law was really only for, non-Israelis, people in the West Bank. So this is a new proposal that has just come up from Mr. Ben-Gvir. And if he does that, it means that the police will have all powers to do anything they want, again, without any court saying anything at all, because it's an administrative detention. So it's like there's no habeas corpus, in other words. Yes, our security minister has been very busy trying to eliminate rights that prisoners have. So he was saying that Arab prisoners in Israeli prisons have too many showers, and they also have too much dental work. So he's trying to work to eliminate those things. Yes. There's one list after another. The government had agreed to a whole list of improvements in schools to improve the teaching, improve the physical aspects of the schools. But when the government realized that this would mean giving money to the schools in the Arab part of Jerusalem, they canceled the program because they didn't want them to get the money. These are all things that happened just this month. I'm writing down one after another. Okay, so that's all for that. I would like to say, to stop for a second and just think of this parallel, that the Arab citizens of Israel, not talking about the people living in Gaza or in the West Bank, but the Arab citizens in Israel, who are 21% of the population, basically enjoy a second-class citizenship. And their status is very similar in many ways to our status as English-speaking people in Quebec. The parallels are really, really, really very strong. In some cases, we in English-speaking Quebec have more privileges or more rights. In some cases, they have more privileges and more rights there. But the idea is that the government in both places would rather that we not be there at all, that we are regarded as a hindrance, that we're regarded as an obstacle to get around. The rights that we have here in Quebec, for example, we have our own university system, our own school system. In Israel, the Arabs have their own school system, but they have no universities. They also have no hospital that's specifically for them. But in terms of other things, in terms of language, for example, there's no sign laws in Israel. So that means that they could put Arab-only signs in all of their towns and cities and villages. They don't serve in the military, but they're allowed to volunteer to serve in the military. This principle was set up at the very beginning of the state. Now, Mr. Ben-Gurion said to himself, look, we have to have compulsory conscription, but how can we call on the Arab citizens to fight against their own cousins if we ever have to go to war with Jordan or with Lebanon or Syria, this type of thing. And of course, we're afraid that if we conscript them, then our security might be at risk because they could be spies and give our secrets out to somebody else. But the but is that if you don't serve in the military, then you not only do you not get all the privileges of a person, all the training, advancement, colleges, scholarships, and all that, but you don't have the connections. You don't have the just the connections that you make in the military to be able to go on to a better career afterwards, especially in the high-tech field. So, some people would say, well, the Arabs are privileged that they don't have to spend 3 years in the military. They could go to school or get a job. But on the other hand, without a military background, so many things are closed to you in Israel. Now, the last time I was to prove how discriminatory the society is, the last time I was in Israel, just walking up and down the streets, and I speak Hebrew perfectly well, or read Hebrew perfectly well. You pass a ladies' clothing store, and the sign in Hebrew says "Help Wanted," and then underneath it says "Must be a graduate of the military." So what that means is we don't want Arabs coming in here to apply for the job. Like, what military experience do you need to be a sales lady in a clothing store? Or the same thing you would see in a restaurant, waiter wanted, must have military experience. Like, what for? So the whole idea is that they just don't want Arabs to come to work in those jobs. Basically, that's what it's all about. The only, and I don't mean it's a big, but the only protection that they might have against all of these sort of discriminatory laws is to go to court and have a lawsuit against the perpetrators of this discrimination. But again, the government of today doesn't want the court to decide in their favor, and so they don't want the court to have the powers to overturn whatever the government does. I mean, it comes down to this existential question. That's really what it's all about. Okay, the other one was the government wanted to outlaw NGOs, that means a non-government organization, which receives money from abroad, from another government. In other words, you have many, many NGOs in Israel. There's hundreds of them working on archaeology, working on science, working on making the desert bloom. The Jewish National Fund is an NGO. Help for soldiers, help for wounded people, help for sick people. Every university has their own fundraising groups abroad. The Magen David Adom, the Red Cross of Israel, has their own. Every organization in Israel has an arm outside of the country to raise money for it. The government doesn't mind any of this. What the government does mind is the left-wing organizations, like there's the one called the B'Tselem, which just tracks Israeli soldiers to see what they're doing, to see if they're helping the settlers beat up the Palestinian, people, to see if there's mistreatment in the West Bank of the people living there by either the government, the soldiers, or by the settlers. And they take videos and they just post them. They interview soldiers to say, what's going on really in the army and stuff like that. So the government really hates that because it kind of is a secret that's supposed to be kept, and they don't want that secret to be revealed. So they wanted to pass a regulation saying that if any organization gets money from a government, outside government, that this organization should not be allowed to do that. They should need a license, they should have to register, they could be controlled. But of course, all of the right-wing organizations, they all get their money from big private donors. Sheldon Adelson and his family and a whole bunch of other big donors give money to Israeli newspapers. They control Israeli press. They control Israeli TV. None of that bothers the government. But, if the, European Union gives some money to one of these sort of human rights organizations in Israel, this is a crisis for the government. So they want to put that into effect. Oh yes, and to tax, that if these people should get the money from a foreign government, that this organization should have to pay 65% of it as tax to the Israeli government. That's the way they want to do it. What else? Oh yes, here's another one. That children who are children of refugees in Israel, and there was once a time in Israel when thousands of people leaving Africa would walk on foot from Sudan, across Egypt, across the Sinai Peninsula, walk into Israel and ask for asylum. And by the rules, Israel would have to accept them, give them shelter, and work on an asylum application. And so these people just got more and more and more, many of them from Eritrea, many of them from Sudan. Those are two of the big, let's say, sources of these people. And Israel couldn't send them back to Sudan because Israel has no diplomatic relations with Sudan. So they were stuck with these people. And in the meantime, as you know, people are people, they want to work, they want to get jobs. They're not allowed to work, so they get work under the table. They work for less money, they crowd into slummy apartments. But the kids are kids. The kids go to school. The kids end up speaking Hebrew, just like all their neighbor kids. And the Israeli government doesn't like this at all, because they say, well, we don't want to prepare these kids for a life in Israel. What we want to do is throw them out. So they just made a decision now that they would take them out of the regular schools and make special schools for them, where they would not be taught anything. They would not be taught anything about the Jewish nature of Israel. They wouldn't be taught about the holidays. They wouldn't be taught a lot of Hebrew. They would be given some kind of a international type education in English and science and math, so that they could be able to be, put out of the country, and they won't have any connection or feeling of closeness to the country. This is something that was decided just now, just this month. All I'm doing by telling you all this is to say that there's practical decisions made for the philosophical idea that the government has, this nationalistic and religious ideas that they have. So it's not enough for the government to have these ideas, they have to put them into practice. And these are just some of the individual little changes and laws that they've made to put these things into practice. That's basically what I'm trying to explain. Yeah, so that's that. Yeah, so let me just see what time it is. Okay, so where are we at with this whole business? What's going to happen? What's going to happen in this judicial crisis? What's happened is that so many people have spoken out against it. People who Israel doesn't care about at all, and people who Israel cares a lot about. The world economy has turned to Israel and said, you know what? We don't like what's going on in the country. The Israeli shekel has dropped by 10% in value since the Netanyahu government took control. The high-tech field that has been the most prominent and most promising part of the Israeli economy has practically not received any kind of new investment in the country. Some of the companies said they're going to be moving abroad. There have been layoffs already in the high-tech field, indirectly because this field is slowing down in Israel. Reservists in the Air Force said, we are not going to go to reserve duty if you put this law into effect. That we don't want to end up being the pawns of a government which says that eventually a quarter of the population doesn't have to serve in the military, and you guys, you have to bear all the risks. And then, of course, the US government itself went to Israel and said, listen, it's not our affair to intervene in your business, in your policies, but by and large, what you're doing is wrong. And if you want help from us, you have to understand our feeling about you. Remember that Israel still receives somewhere around $4 billion a year of US foreign aid. So that's what slowed up this whole process. The most thing that slowed it up was the united opposition of all those hundreds of thousands of people who turned out weekend after weekend to demonstrate. And so the government is trying to come up with a solution which gives them what they want, but which in some ways seems a little bit more fair than what they were proposing. And that's in essence what's happening now. The fight is over how much say should the opposition have over appointing Supreme Court judges, while the government says we still have the ultimate say. In other words, whether whether it's a 6-3 or 5-4 doesn't much matter to the people who have the 5 or the 6. You know, but it just looks better if it's 5-4 rather than 6-3. That's kind of what the government is aiming at. But it's something which has shaken the country so much that people who are on the center and on the left wing of Israeli politics, which admittedly are maybe only 40% of the country, among those 40%, a lot of people are looking abroad and looking to leave the country because they say they can't live in that sort of society. And, you know, countries like Spain and Portugal have been offering citizenship to Jews of that origin. And Poland was doing the same thing, and Germany was doing the same thing. Guess who announced today that they might do the same thing? Morocco. The proposal came from the Moroccan government that Jews who are of Moroccan origin, even if it's their grandchildren, should have the right to get Moroccan citizenship. Just imagine what a thunderclap, what a revolutionary idea that is. You know, they say, well, it was proposed by one of the members of parliament in the Moroccan parliament. It's not a law yet, but it might be. And it just goes to show, in other words, how somehow, you know, everything that goes around comes around. It's just such a remarkable idea that an Arab state would say, you know, we want to give you citizenship back because we appreciate who you were and we would like you to contribute to our country. And so the king is in favor of it. So we'll see how far that goes, but it was just announced today. I mean, imagine what a step that was to people who you know, many, well, let's put it like this, that the Moroccan Jews who left Morocco are not in the same situation as Egyptian Jews who left Egypt, or Syrian Jews who left Syria, or Libyan Jews who left Libya. They weren't kicked out to say, or slamming the door in your face and never come back. And most of them who left just left on their own, you know, without bad feelings toward their country. So anyway, that's the story, and that's a kind of a take from a liberal point of view of what's going on in the country. Now, if I was a different person and I was giving it to you from a nationalistic religious point of view or point of view, I'd say, listen, we got 64 seats, you got 56 seats, we were elected, we could do whatever we want. Israel is a Jewish state. We have to try to promote Judaism, and Judaism means Judaism inspired by religion in all aspects of Israeli society. We don't want influence from foreign governments to tell us or our people what to do. In essence, since the Arabs fought against us in 1948 and have continued to fight against us by means of terrorism, and 2 more wars in 56, in 73, in 1982, in 2000, and all the Gaza operations, that basically you can't trust Arabs at all. Whether they're in the country or out of the country, if they're not our enemies now, they're going to be our enemies in the future. So we want to make life as uncomfortable for them as possible. So maybe they'll leave the country on their own. And if they don't leave the country, they'll know who's boss. Basically, that would be the take of the people from the religious right part of the Israeli spectrum. Many people have said, and I'm going to finish with this because I just read this today again, that Israel is turning into an Iran, that it won't be long before the Ayatollahs of Israel take over the country. And Israel will be exactly like Iran in that way. You know, they'll put regulations on what length of skirts women are allowed to wear, what clothes they're allowed to wear, what beaches they're allowed to go on, what violations of the Sabbath or selling unkosher food will bring you a jail sentence. You know, this idea is not far off in the minds of the most radical of Israelis. You know, they would like they look at Iran, they say, yeah, you know, that's what we want here. We want the religious people to control the life of the state because it's simple. God gave Israel to us. We know what God wants, and we will be God's messengers to carry out his wishes in the country. That's all, simple. So, okay, I think I've spoken enough. I'm sure you have ideas, comments, questions. You know, you clearly understand that I'm coming at you from a point of view, but I'd like to know where you think this point of view is wrong. So that's that. Let me just sit down for a second because it's still painful. I'm telling you, it's no joke. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Something about the so-called human rights organizations, others who get a lot or most financing from foreign sources. Thinks the land would be a good example. But also, if you include Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch,
Right. Right.
Because these organizations presented information, videos, publications which are totally misleading, out of context, and often downright lies.
Right. So Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. I mean, these are international organizations. Their focus is not only Israel for sure, but there are no shortage of let's call them people who just from the get-go don't believe that Israel should exist as a Jewish state, and who want to try to trip up Israel in any way they can, and to fund organizations which fundamentally not only oppose the government of Israel, but really oppose Israel altogether. Some of these people, just like I said, they would love to be able to turn the clock back to 1948, when Israel was not an independent country, and to say, let's start all over from that point of view. I think it's important to separate what they're doing from the reasons why they're doing it. In other words, let's say, for example, you have well, as often happens now, you have settlers who often live on hilltops, and they'll go down into the valleys and steal or beat up or burn Palestinian olive groves, or set fire to their cars, or break their windows in their houses. And it's, let's say, Human Rights Watch, who might they know which are the more sensitive points, which are the conflict points. They'll have somebody with a camera there all the time, and they'll take a picture of it, and they'll say, look, this is what's happening. Now you could say, well, these people don't really care. They're just anti-Israel. They're just using this as a means to get back at Israel. Correct, this is correct. But the fact is, they did take a picture of something that did happen. they're interested in this conflict in order to present the side of the Arabs, and that's what they're doing. Now, you know, in a democracy where you have freedom of the press, these people have a right to be there and to take pictures. The government doesn't like that. They don't want them to be there because it embarrasses them. But like I said, so long as they don't fake, make up, splice, invent, you know, stuff like that. Well, but that's why you have people. That's why you need to have Israeli reporters and Israeli news people at the same demonstration in the same place, taking the same pictures to say this never happened. But the government discourages that. They don't want anybody to look at what's going on. The people who carry out these things wear masks. The people who carry out these things somehow are never prosecuted. If they happen to catch somebody, as what happened, you know, they had a case where this is what did happen. The army started to chase these guys who were doing it. A guy got into a car, started driving, and he turned over his car and had an accident. And then his lawyer blamed Israel for the damages that he had because they were chasing him. But like, why were they chasing him? You know, so this just happened. This is a case that's quite famous in the Israeli in the news. So my point of view is that yeah, there's people who do things even for, I would say, malicious reasons, and that they apply a double standard to Israel, which is really annoying. Because like, where is Human Rights Watch in Sudan looking after all the people who are being hurt over there? So very often you hear that Israelis complain that Israel is held to a double standard, and that in essence it's anti-Semitism and anti-Israelness that is motivating these people, and not just a kind of a search for justice and for human rights. But the two things are not contradictory. That's what my point is, they're not contradictory. That it is true that Israel is being held to a double standard. It's true. But the but is that Israel proclaims itself to be a democratic country with full human rights. Sudan doesn't call itself a democratic country with full human rights. Neither does Libya, neither does any of these, Iran or any of these countries. But if you are acting and telling the world you are a democratic country with full human rights, then the standards to judge you should be higher than the ones judging what goes on in Zaire. Only when Zaire, when the army comes and starts murdering people, you know, by the hundreds, then the United Nations says, oh my God, we got to do something. But in a democratic country, if you violate human rights in a much more minor way, you still should be criticized because you are telling the world you are a democratic country with human rights. That's the difference. Yeah.
I know.
You're going to have to speak a bit louder because it's.
And here you.
So I would say that they were part of it. And that Nikki Haley defended Israel like
She does a great job.
She does a wonderful job. We were-
By the way, I have the original picture of the kid being beat up by an Israeli policeman that started on this reporting.
Right.
You remember that?
So I didn't really hear what you said, but maybe you could tell us what you said. Oh, honest reporting, okay.
And I just told her, I have the original picture that started on this reporting. I think it was published in the Chicago newspaper. Showed a teenager with blood running down his head, an Israeli policeman with his back unraised and with no vicious expression on his face. And the report was, this is what Israeli policemen do to Arabs.
Right.
But
It was a fake picture.
the grandfather recognized the kid. The kid was an American tourists in Israel, he had been accosted by 4 Arabs, also teenagers, who were beating him up and probably would have beaten him to death. But the
Right.
Israeli policemen drove them off.
Right. But they just got a picture of those two. Yeah.
Not only they have the picture,
Right.
they published it that it's an Israeli policeman beating up an Arab.
Right. So it completely false. So,
And that is what makes the left on.
no, I agree with you. There's no contradiction between what you're saying and what I'm saying. I mean, you know, if you want, there's plenty, Israel has enough enemies who could fake pictures, who could fake films, who could splice stuff together, who could do all kinds of stuff. But Israel has the means to say, hey, wait a minute, this picture of this kid you took was taken in Chicago, it wasn't taken here. You know what I mean? Oh, no, if there's,
They publish everything negative about Israel, including misleading.
Yeah. all of this,
They won't publish anything.
but remember, it's up to a TV station to decide what's news, right? So that's one point. But it doesn't excuse real misbehavior that Israel does do often to all kinds of people that happen to, and most of the stuff that they do never gets, you know, caught on camera type of thing. I'll give you an example that happened, it was today in the parliament, okay? So you know that the Israeli Arab community has gone through and is going through a horrible situation of murders in the country. Since the beginning of the year, there have been 103 Arabs murdered in the country, almost all of them by other Arabs, okay? The traditional Israeli sort of viewpoint to this was, you know what? We don't really care, because so long as one Arab is killing another Arab, what do we care? They're just, let them sort it out among themselves. Let the schoolboys fight among themselves. But it's come to a point where there's so many of them that, you know, people are being dragged into this to show that this is a real crisis. Of all crazy things, the security minister, Mr. Ben-Gvir, is the most anti-Arab of any minister that has ever held office in the government. He's so anti-Arab and so racist that when he tried to enlist in the military, they refused to accept him on the grounds that he's a racist and we don't want racists in the military. That his political party predecessor was outlawed from running in the Knesset because they were a racist party. In other words, you're not allowed to be a racist party and run for office. And that's exactly the guy. He has defended as a lawyer, he's defended every single Jewish person who has ever attacked an Arab in the country. That's his whole job as a lawyer. Now, here's the guy who's being told, oh, you have to now find a solution to all the murders in the Arab community. So his one solution his one solution was, well, I want to put a law saying that I can hold any Arab in detention for as long as I want as a security measure. His other idea, and this goes to Mr. Netanyahu, to call in the Shin Bet, which is the Israeli FBI, the Israeli Secret Service, to be involved in this domestic, terror campaign in the Arab community. It's a real crisis in Israel that the people are beginning to realize. Now, if you ask the Arab community themselves what they want, they say, well, look, the police have ignored us for all these years. You never could call a police person because they'd never show up. We want to stop being second-class citizens. We want to have the same opportunities as Israelis have in general, so that our kids, instead of being unemployed and joining gangs, would be able to, have decent training, have decent prospects, have decent places to live, and decent schools. And all of these we don't have because we are second-class citizens. So that's their solution to this issue. It's a long-term solution, obviously, it's not a short-term solution. But this crime, and they say, well, how come that organized crime, that, Israel used to have an organized crime problem, that the Jewish organized criminals, they were able to all capture, and the Arab organized criminals and gangs, you don't do anything about them. Why is that? So, this is a dilemma, or it's an issue that's now facing Israeli society as a whole, simply because this is going to spill over into the Jewish part of Israeli society inevitably. Once organized crime gets going and gangs get going, it's just going to spread. And so what Mr. Ben-Gvir did yesterday, because Israel doesn't give building permits to Arabs because they don't want them spreading around, Arabs have to live somewhere, so they build houses illegally on land that either they don't own or they do own, but they don't have building permits to build, and they build them. And what happens is, of course, that the Israeli government, especially with this new guy, goes ahead and brings bulldozers and knocks them down. So he knocked down five homes in a Bedouin village today. And they say, okay, so this is your answer to organized crime in the Arab community. You're so busy knocking down houses instead of trying to get the police to, which you're responsible for, to arrest the criminals in Arab society. So in other words, it's just, you could say that you're confusing two things. You could say to me, well, look, one has nothing to do with the other. But the fact is that a pattern develops, and Mr. Ben-Gvir is considered a persona non grata all over Europe and all over even the Jewish world in the United States refuse to meet with him because of who he is. And this is not Mr. Ben-Gvir's fault. He never changed his ideas. He never changed his personality. He always said, this is who I am. It's Mr. Netanyahu's fault for allowing somebody like this to be in the government. And it's Mr. Netanyahu's fault for doing it because the only way Netanyahu could stay in power was to get these racists on his government, because no one else would agree to serve with him, because he's trying to keep out of jail. So this is all part of the ongoing political drama of Israel. Let's put it like that. Yeah.
Is there a possibility that he could ever become prime minister?
Ben-Gvir? No, impossible. Impossible. No. That's impossible. The polls are showing today his party got 14 seats in the last election, and the polls are showing that if a new election were held, he'd be somewhere between 11 and 12. So it's down by about 10%. Yeah.
Where does the Palestinian Authority fit into all this? You haven't talked about that.
Well, the Palestinian, according to the agreements that were made between Israel and the Palestinian Authority back in '94, they divided. First of all, let's leave Gaza out of it completely. The Palestinian Authority is supposed to have authority in Gaza, but they have no authority whatsoever. So in the West Bank itself, which in Israel is never referred to as the West Bank anymore, it's called Judea and Samaria, they divided into three sections. The Arab towns, the cities, like Nablus or Jenin or Tulkarem or Kalkilia, Jericho, Hebron, Bethlehem, Ramallah, those are the main ones, that the Palestinian Authority would have 100% jurisdiction in those towns. They would have jurisdiction over the economy, jurisdictions over healthcare, municipal services, and police services. That's just the idea of those towns. And those towns contain about half of the population of the whole West Bank. Then they have something called Area B, which is an area which contains most of the rest of the Palestinian villages, where the Palestinian Authority would have civilian control, but the Israeli military would have defense or military or security control. And then you have something called Area C, which is the areas where mostly in the south of the West Bank and around Jerusalem, where the Israelis would have both civilian control and military control. And that was the arrangement that was made. The Palestinian Authority from their end have turned out to be a corrupt, weak, disorganized government, a government caught between a rock and a hard place. If they're seen to cooperate too much with Israel, they're condemned by their own people. If they don't cooperate with Israel at all, Israel just turns off the tap of the water and says, okay, sorry, you don't get any water. And that's their situation. Supposedly, they're supposed to be elected. They had elections in 2009, I think it was, or 2005. And that's the last election they ever had. Mr. Abbas is now 87 years old. He has no successor. His government today is looked upon mostly as a bunch of bureaucrats enriching themselves by the population. He has no real support at all. But Israel is propping them up and keeping them in place because Israel fears that if he falls and a more radical group takes over, like Hamas, then it will just mean trouble for Israel. But if an election were held today, a free election in the West Bank, Hamas would probably win the election, and not the Fatah movement.
But his speeches are so anti-Israel.
Well, I mean, you have to understand, his speeches are anti-Israel because that's what his own people feel. That's what his own people, want. The West Bank, which has 2.5 million people, has been living under Israeli occupation since 1967. Now, Israel never went ahead to say, we want to give you independence or autonomy on the one hand, and they never said, okay, let's all be one country and we'll give you all citizenship on the other hand. Israel tried to kind of get the best of both worlds, and it leaves the people with the feeling that they have no authority and no control over their own lives. And they see bit by bit that Israel is taking over land in the West Bank and giving it to Jewish settlers so that they could never have their own country. And Saudi Arabia just made a statement today, which repeated what they've always said, is look, unless Israel agrees to establish a Palestinian state, we are not going to have relations with Israel. And that's it. So there's a cost. People will say that there's two reasons for Israel controlling this territory. One is for security, that if they don't control the territory, Israel would be much weaker if an army were to develop in the West Bank. And one is for religious reasons, which is God gave that land to the Jewish people, and now we have it, and we're not giving it back. So those are the two kind of motivations. And so, Israel is stuck. They're basically stuck. They're as stuck as the Palestinians are. Yeah, in the back. How long is the elections? 4 years. If the government doesn't fall, which it usually falls. Usually it falls, and I predict this one will fall too. They can't last 4 years with this sort of tension. And I'm telling you, if I had to guess, the fall of the government would not be because of Israel's relationship with the Arabs or the racist ministers that they have. Instead, it will fall over religious matters that the ultra-Orthodox parties will just not be able to take whatever the Israeli government wants to do. So, for example, one of the changes that they want to make up to so-called fix this issue of conscription is to lower the age of exemption for yeshiva students to not go in the army. So what they had done up until now, they said, okay, look, we are not going to conscript yeshiva students up until the age of 25. So in other words, you finish your school at 18. Normally at 18, you're supposed to go into the army. In order not to go into the army, all the Orthodox people send their kids to yeshivas for 7 years. Now, these people could be ignoramuses. They could be like zero as far as students are concerned. All they have to do is sit in yeshiva to get paid by the state for scholarships until they get to 25. And then once they're 25, the exemption, the conscription age is over. You see? So that's been the system up until now. In order to kind of, and Israel knows that this is a tremendous waste. It's a waste of the time of the students in the yeshivas because they don't do anything there. They don't learn anything there. They just sit there and take the government's money. So what they want to do is to lower that age from 25 to 23, which is still ridiculous. But it would mean the government paying 2 years less of subsidies for these people. It would mean that these people could get on with their lives 2 years faster rather than stick it out for 7 years in the yeshiva. They just would stick it out for 5 years. But of course, the religious parties are not happy about that. So this is where the government is going to end up falling over something like that.
Can the Knesset decide to have an earlier election?
If the government can decide, sure, very often they do that. The government itself says, we want to dissolve ourselves. We vote to dissolve the Knesset, like it could be done here, like it's done in Parliament all the time. We want to dissolve the Knesset and hold new elections. Yeah, they do that all the time. Because, well, one reason for doing it, like in the previous 4 times, was that normally, if the government votes to dissolve itself, the president can say, well, okay, let me give the leader of the opposition a chance to make a government before calling new elections. So what the government would do is they would say, okay, no, we're dissolving the Knesset and calling new elections at the same time. So in order to prevent, the opposition from getting a chance to make a government. Now that's not possible. In other words, under this setup that they have now, the government of Israel with 64 seats is pretty strong. Unless somebody caves, they could stay in power for 4 years as is. But you never know. Israeli politics are funny. You never know. There have been many governments in the past in Israel where the ultra-Orthodox parties have been part of even a labor government in power. So the ultra-Orthodox parties are not concerned with anything except themselves. And, if they get a better offer from somebody else, they would take it. Yes, sir, go ahead.
I want to ask your opinion of the kind of vocabulary we use. The people who, Jews, I guess, who live, established communities beyond the 1948 armistice lines are called settlers.
Right. Correct.
But before 48, there were a lot of Jewish communities in those areas, and they were wiped out by the Jordan Legion and by the Egyptian army. In many cases, people were slaughtered if they couldn't get away. So if they go back 20 or 30 years later and reestablish those communities, is settler the right term to apply to them? Because that has some kind of a negative implication. They're just reestablishing communities.
Okay, so, okay, I understand the question. You understand, and what you say is true, that before 1948, there were some Jewish settlements, especially between Jerusalem and Hebron, where Jews had been living for a long time, including the city of Hebron itself, and which in the 1948 war, well, like you said, before 48, these settlements were attacked and the people left. And even in the 1948 war, Jews who were living in the old city of Jerusalem were evacuated because they, would have been under Jordanian rule. And is it right to call them settlers if they go back to live to where they were living? Let's put it like this. Israel never annexed the territories that they captured except for Jerusalem. In other words, by rules of the UN, by rules of the United Nations, if you captured a territory that wasn't yours and you have no agreement to keep that territory, but you're keeping it by force, you are not allowed to introduce new populations to come into that territory to change the demographic balance of that country. That's what the UN says. That's what the rules are. So the settlers who do go to live in that part of the country, by international law, are considered to be occupiers or people who don't have the right to go live there, except they're doing it by force. So that's the answer to that question. Now, the other part of that question is that if they are allowed to go live there because they were living before, why aren't the Palestinians who are living in Haifa and in Jaffa, why aren't they allowed to come to live back where they were living before 1948? And the Israeli government passed a law right away saying that if you have 3 days to show up back to where you were, otherwise you lose all your rights forever and ever. In other words, they wanted them to lose all their rights forever and ever, and they did. So that's the answer to that question. The question has been put to Mr. Abbas to say, look, if you form a Palestinian state, would Jews be allowed to live in a Palestinian state just the way Arabs are living in Israel? In other words, they're not the majority. They're living there. They could pay taxes there. They could work there. They may get citizenship or not citizenship, but the fact is they're living there, and you can't uproot 500,000 people just for that reason. And there wasn't a clear answer. He did not give a clear answer to that question. Some authorities, some of the spokesmen said yes, some of them said no, because we can't trust them, because they would be agents of the Israeli government, they would try to disrupt our rule and all that. And other people said, yeah, well, it sort of makes sense. Why not have them or their answer was they would never want to live in a Palestinian state, which is correct. They would never want to live in a Palestinian state. So that's really the answer. I mean, but that is a solution to the problem, to have these people have a choice to stay in this new country or to leave in the new country. But, the settlers who went there specifically, many of them went there specifically to not have a Palestinian state. It was a political decision for them to go and live there so that the Palestinians would never have a state. Now a Palestinian state is being created and you're being told, well, you could live here as a citizen, you have to respect our laws and all that. They'd say never in a million years, and they just pick up and leave and go back and make a claim for their financial losses to the Israeli government. That's what would happen. Some few, especially if they're ultra-Orthodox, they would stay if that's the case, but that's a handful of people. Anyway, listen, I want to thank everybody. So I see people it's 3:38. We'll pick a different side. I'm always, every time I read a new thing, I say, oh my God, I can't believe this. I have to, it all fits with a pattern, let's put it like that. But we'll pick a different subject for next week. And if you've got anything you'd like me to speak about, please tell me, and I will. So thanks again. What, next week? I kind of look at the week's news to kind of think about it, but as you know, I could speak about pretty well anything. So, there's always lots. I'm inspired by what happens in the news over the week. And, And but what I read an awful lot. I spend, especially nowadays, I can't go to the gym. I'm just pretty well reading the whole day long.
Is next week the last week?
Is next week the last week? Wait a minute. Yeah, it is.
Gonna miss you.